Today on the podcast, we are going to be talking about how to read when your hands are full. Reading gives us so much joy, but we need to make time for it. And that can be tricky whenever you have a lot of little kids running around. So this is how I make sure that I cultivate my reading life, even with little kids in tow. Welcome to A More Beautiful Life Collective, the podcast where I help Christian women bridge the gap between the woman that they want to be and the life that they're currently living, with grace, simple rhythms, and a heart rooted in God. I'm your host, Casey Fletcher. Let's take the next step together. Hey everyone, and welcome to A More Beautiful Life Collective podcast. I'm Casey Fletcher, and I'm here to walk hand in hand with you as we grow in grace, build with purpose, and live beautifully. I hope that you guys have been doing well. So this is part of our series on what to do when your hands are full, when you have lots of little kids in the house, a lot of life going on, and you feel a little bit overwhelmed. There's so many things that we can do to give us life. But how do we make time for those things? How do we make time for things like self-care, for things like planning, for things like goal setting, for things like reading, for spiritual disciplines? How do we make time for these things that we know are worth it, but they always seem like they fall on the back burner? So in the last episode, we talked about goal setting when our hands are full. And today we're going to talk about reading when our hands are full. And I'm also going to talk about my top 5 books for the year. These past few weeks, there's always something going on. There's always something that kind of gets in the way. The podcast is something that I do, that I enjoy doing, but it's one of those things that when your hands are full, when you have lots of little kids running around, it always seems to get on the back burner. So I'm here today and I'm grateful for that. One of the things that I have been doing recently that's been giving me joy, that's something that I want to talk about a little bit on the podcast, is sourdough. So I've been getting back into baking my own sourdough. I have done fresh milled flour, which is a whole different animal. It's something we can talk about later, but sourdough is something that I really enjoy doing, but I kind of put that on the back burner while I was learning how to bake with fresh milled flour. And recently I pulled out the starter and I pulled out just normal bread flour and I started making some things that it's harder to do with fresh milled flour. And so I've been getting back into that. And I've actually been writing a little bit on the blog. We'll talk about this a little bit more in a future episode, but about practicing some of these household arts, some of these things that are skills, that are arts that you grow in. And so I've been writing about that on the blog. But sourdough, it's one of those things that you have to cultivate a starter in order to bake with sourdough. That's part of it. And I've heard people say, it's like, sourdough. It's just another thing that you have to feed, another thing you have to keep alive. And whenever you're struggling, to keep your kids and your animals and sometimes your husband alive, why would I want to add another thing to that list? But one thing that I found is that it's in those things that we really find the most joy. It's in those things that we find these lessons that they impact us and they teach us and they shape us and they form us by the daily returning. There's a reason why these things give us so much joy. And I think it's because they cultivate these rhythms of returning and tending that we so easily can forget in modern life. And the reason why I'm bringing that up today is I've been thinking about that. I've been working on something that's really exciting. I'm not going to share what it is today, but it's an exciting thing that I'm doing on the blog that I have been working on and formatting and designing and writing. And I've been thinking about this idea of returning and tending, what we can learn from sourdough. And as I've thought about it, I've also thought about how that relates to this idea of cultivating your reading life. Reading is one of those things that I really do believe can change us. It shapes us, it forms us. But it's one of those things that you have to return and tend. With my sourdough starter, if I leave it in the fridge for, a week, it's fine. But much longer than that, and it starts to grow, gray, and then it goes black, and then you open it up and there's this mold on the top and it smells terrible. It smells like feet, and it's this whiff of decay as soon as you open it up. So you have these two, polar opposites, right? Where it's this life-giving thing that's full of life, that's bubbly, and it creates this delicious bread that just fills your home with this cozy atmosphere. Or in the same thing, it's this thing that's, full of death and decay, something that's, that's terrible. And the thing that makes the difference is our ability to return and tend to those things that give us life. And so as I've thought about this, I think your reading life is the same. We see these truths in all these different areas of life, whether that's your spiritual life or your relationships. But I think your reading life is the same, where if we aren't careful, it can easily be something that we just let fall away. We want to scroll for 5 more minutes instead of pick up a book. We want to turn on the show and kind of veg out. And then we end up just kind of letting the things that would give us life, letting the things that would intellectually sharpen us, we end up letting those things just die. And we replace them with things that either are like the junk food of reading or things that are just the junk food of the mind, whether that's, Netflix or YouTube videos or whatever it is. And so what I want to talk about today is cultivating our reading life. And then I'm going to share with you my top 5 books for 2026, because I think that it's important to cultivate your reading life. So I was reading in this magazine. So I use Memorial Press for my homeschool curriculum, and it's a classical curriculum that uses Latin as its spine. And so one of the things that it really focuses on is how you can cultivate your own pursuit of knowledge, your own learning in your life. And they talk about why this is so important. And obviously it's because we are the model for our children. And so this is what they wrote in, this is their spring 2025 magazine. But it talks about in this article what the left-brainers get right about, curriculum and the purpose of curriculum. And it mentions with the humanities that unfortunately, this is a quote from the article, unfortunately, the world seems to have forgotten why we read. So it's no surprise that humanities sequences, when they exist, reflect a way of waywardness. Without a clear destination, how can teachers possibly know how to get there? When we don't know why we read, it doesn't matter what we read. Somehow, many educators don't understand, or they don't agree, that the purpose of literature is to better understand the human condition and to hopefully develop the soul and grow in virtue. Without understanding these ends, reading is readily reduced to being merely a vehicle for extended phonics training and improved reading comprehension. And to me, that really just shows us what is wrong with the reading life of so much of the modern age, and also how we can get back on track, how we can do it right. I think we've all probably had the experience, whether it's with our own kids that, maybe we have a child that doesn't like reading, or, I've taught kids that don't like reading, and they're like, what is the point in this? Like, why am I reading these books? Especially now that everything can be read to you, or you can listen to it, or you can just watch it. But this is what it says. Again, the purpose of literature is to better understand the human condition and to hopefully develop the soul and grow in virtue. And really, Memorial Press, their whole idea is that education is about the training of virtue. And so as we come to literature, as we come to books, as we read, we are being developed in virtue. It's not just something for our kids. Like, yes, you understand and you learn and you grow as a child, as you read and encounter these great books, whether that's Winnie the Pooh or The Great Gatsby. You are encountering virtue and you are taking part of that. You are learning what it means to be a good human. What is good, true, and beautiful? I love the picture of your palate. If you have ever gone on a diet, it's like, you say, okay, I'm getting rid of these soft drinks. I'm getting rid of these processed foods. Maybe I'm cutting back on, the drive-through. If you've ever gone through that, sometimes you have cravings, but then after a while, you start to prefer the healthy things. And then whenever you have Coke or Chick-fil-A or whatever, you taste it and you're like, this isn't as good as I remember. And that's the thing, you're cultivating your palate. And I think our reading life should pursue this, that we are cultivating our palate to be good, true, and beautiful, to train us up in virtue. So as I think about my reading life and my reading goals, I always have a reading goal. Last year, my goal was to read 100 books, which, in years past, there was one year I read 80 books whenever I was in college. And I have read, between, I think one year I was like trying to get there at the last moment, reading 52 books. That used to be my goal. And so I was reading like the last book on the last day. And then a couple years, I was hitting 60, 70. And last year, let's see if I can find my goal. Last year, my goal was 100 books. And I think I got to 65 books for last year. And part of that was because last year was kind of a struggle. There was a lot of things going on. We had a lot of people over. And so I didn't have as much time to read. Also, it's hit or miss. Sometimes you read a lot whenever you have a baby that's nursing. Sometimes you don't. And last year I found myself reaching for my phone a lot more than reaching for a book. But my goal this year is I want to hit 100 books. And I also want to tackle several titles on my TBR list, my to be read list. Because my goal is that every book that I own, I want to read. And so that's my goal. But also my goal is I want to make sure that I'm cultivating this pursuit of virtue in my life. And I think the way that I do that, and the way that you can do this too, is to discern what is good, true, and beautiful, and try to guide your reading life to those things, to the best of what's out there. I think reading, a lot of people are talking about, America, we're illiterate. But I think books are kind of coming back in style. But the thing is, you want to make sure that just because it's a book doesn't mean it's virtuous. And there's been a lot of books recently that have been really popular. Some books that I've read and I enjoyed and I used to recommend to people, but they were not in any way virtuous. They were the opposite of that. So you want to make sure that as you're using this, that you, just like you have that discernment with what you're watching, that what you're reading is also pushing you on towards that virtuous path. If you struggle with reading, if you feel like, oh, my hands are so full, like I get that this is a lofty goal, I get that this is a thing that's good, this pursuit of virtue, but how? How do I actually do this? One of the best, a couple of the best tips that I can give you is this. First, set a goal. Whether that's 5 books, whether it's 10 pages a day, whether it's a book a week, so that'd be 52 books, whatever that is, I would recommend setting a goal. And then I would make it easy on yourself. And you can do that by keeping a book by you. For me, I have a little bag that I keep like my crochet stuff, so my handicrafts in, a notebook, sometimes my computer, and then I always have a book or a magazine, if I'm catching up on some things that I'm reading. And I keep that and I carry it around with me wherever I go. So if I'm, nursing or if I'm outside with the kids, it's something that makes it easy to just pull out and choose to read in that moment rather than scrolling on your phone. I also would keep it interesting. I have literally 20 books always that I'm going through. Normally, I don't read all of those at one time. Like sometimes I'll set it down for a while and then pick it back up. I've been going through Kristen Lavransdatter for 2 years now. And so I'm halfway through. And I did that with the Count of Monte Cristo too, because those are really long books. So I kind of treat them like a series. And I read a couple hundred pages and I set it down and then another couple hundred pages. But I think definitely you should read as you want to with certain books. Sometimes it's nice to just power through. You never want to not finish a book just because you're bouncing around so much. But you're going to read less if you have said, oh, I've been reading this book for 5 years and I just can't get through it. It's okay, abandon that book, move on, keep it interesting. And lastly, I would talk about it. I would find people that love to read that you can either recommend books to, pass them around, or you can also find a book club, and you can read through those books together. And something, as a little teaser, this thing that I'm working on, we are going to be working in a book club to A More Beautiful Life Collective. And that's something that I'm really excited about, where we can read these books together and talk about them so that we can, again, grow on this virtuous path. So the way that I make sure that I'm working through books is I add in reading to my morning routine. And I've talked about this before on the podcast, but this really is something that makes sure that I can read, even if I'm out and about all day and there's a lot of busyness going on, making sure that I read a little bit each day keeps me moving through books. So what I do is normally I wake up, unload the dishwasher, start the washing machine, and then I do my Bible reading. And then after that, I try to read at least 10 pages in a few books. So some days it'll just be one book. Some days I might work through 2 or 3, depending on what's on my stack. And, if you do that, if you read 10 pages a day, most books are between 250 pages to 300 pages. You'll get through at least a book a month if you're just reading 10 pages a day in the morning. And that's maybe 5 or 10 extra minutes. So if your Bible reading time normally lasts 15 minutes, it'd be 25 minutes. And I think you can work that time in. So that's how I make sure that, even if life is busy, last year was busy, but I was still able to read 65 books. And it was because I was reading in 2 or 3 books a day, 10 pages. So at least that's 25 books right there that I'm able to read throughout the year. And then the other books that you may want to add on, fiction books, things like that, then you can carry those with you through the day. Sometimes I try to read, 10 or 20 pages at night, but I always am falling asleep by like 9 o'clock. So I don't always get to that. But that's another thing that you can do. So I would really recommend looking at your morning routine and your evening routine and trying to habit stack and add on reading to one of those things. So here are my top 5 books for 2026. So one of the books that I got, I use the library. So some of these books I have with me, some I'll just show the picture on the video because I use the library for some of them. But one of the best book that I read last year was The Scent of Water by Elizabeth Googe. And this is one I've heard recommended. Sarah and Sally Clarkson have recommended it. I've heard other people, but it's set in right around, the middle of the century, last century, in the 1950s or so. And it's in the English countryside. And it's this woman who's moving from the city to the countryside to this old house. And it's kind of her finding her way back to her faith, to her country roots, as well as, you watch kind of people work out their life, faithfulness despite hard circumstances. It's just beautiful. The writing is beautiful and it really places you there while also being an uplifting story that I think will challenge you. So that was the best book that I read last year. Definitely worth the read. The next best book that I read was Jesus the King. It's also called King's Cross by Tim Keller. And I love Tim Keller. He's a great author. But this book was really good. Like you read and so much about Jesus's life, but this was one of those books that I read it and I saw his life anew. I experienced the gospel again in a different way. And so this is one that I definitely would recommend. The next one that I thought was excellent and I recommend it is Sacred Seasons. I've talked about it before on the podcast. We talked about it with our episode on Lent and on the church calendar, but this goes through the church calendar season by season. It starts with Advent and then ends with Ordinary Time. That goes through November, and it gives you ideas for each part of the church calendar. And so I really recommend that one. I think that one is great. I also threw a Donald Whitney kick last year. So he is a guy, I have 2 of his books here and I don't have the other one that I read, but he wrote Spiritual Disciplines for the Christian Life, which I think is the most popular one that he wrote, which is good and practical. But I also, from this book, I learned about these other 2 books. So this is Praying the Bible, and then the other one is Family Worship. And both of those, they're short. You could probably read this in an afternoon, honestly, because they are very short and practical, but it gives you great tips for how to implement these things in your life. So Praying the Bible is teaching you how to do the spiritual discipline of going through and praying through scripture. And so he recommends praying through the Psalms, but there's also other ways to do that. And then Family Worship is how to set up a time in your home for family worship so that you can teach your kids what you believe. And that's something that I think is lacking sometimes in modern families. And so that was great. The other one, and this is kind of switching gears from the Christian books that I was reading, is Profit First, which if you have a business, this is one that you definitely need to read. He is kind of like the Dave Ramsey, but of the business world, where he talks about how to make sure that your business is turning a profit, and you do that by paying yourself first. And so if you can get a lot of tips for your own personal finance as well from that book. So to me, this is something that it was a life-changing book for me. And after implementing his tips, like, I definitely think, it's worth the read, especially if you own a business or have your hands on money in any kind of way. So those were the top 5 books for 2025. To close, I just want to encourage you, reading is such a life-giving pursuit. It's well worth the time to devote ourselves to the pursuit of reading, to the pursuit of virtue, which is what that education is. And so as you are thinking about this upcoming year, we're almost, 2 months in, what are your reading goals? If it was to do 52 books, but you've only picked up 1 book, how could you work out this habit in your own life so that you can pursue that more and more? I would love to know your reading goals for this year, so you can comment below and let me know. Or if you have a book that you read that you absolutely love, I would love to have your recommendation. You can comment below and let me know what that is. Until next time, keep creating a life you love and cultivating your heart for God. I'm Casey Fletcher, and I'll see you next week. Thanks so much for joining me this week on a More Beautiful Life Collective podcast. If you love what you heard, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with a friend. You can also visit my blog at amorebeautifullifecollective.com for more resources, printables, and guides to help you cultivate faith, purpose, and joy every day. Until next time, keep creating a life you love and cultivate your heart for God.